Tonight's notes are about the Stamp Act and the colonial responses to the Stamp Act. So up to this point, we've talked about the Navigation Acts, which were some of the first real instances of the British Crown putting control over the colonies, kind of exerting its control and putting those rules in place for trading. We talked as well about the French and Indian War and how Great Britain won this worldwide war, which included fighting in the American colonies, and how that got them a lot more land in the American colonies, but that it also came at a very heavy price. And Great Britain saw its national debt double after the French and Indian War, because wars were expensive propositions, as they still are today. So in this set of notes, we're really going to be looking at how Great Britain tries to address the issue of their national debt, how they try to raise some money and get the colonists involved in the act. And that's the Stamp Act. What you see here is not the actual stamp itself. In fact, this was an example of colonial response, saying, you want to put a stamp on us? Yeah, here's where you can put it. So first off, Parliament passed the Stamp Act to raise money. That was the entire point of it. It was a tax, raise money to help pay for the French and Indian War, and also to help defend the American colonies, because they were going to leave some troops behind in order to continue to defend the colonies. And they did not expect the Stamp Act to cause a huge stir in the colonies, but it did. So how did it work? It's pretty simple, really. You needed to use specially stamped paper for most anything official. Any sort of legal documents like marriage licenses, newspapers, other sort of licenses, even sometimes things as simple as playing cards, certainly cargo lists or passenger lists for ships, official documents, pretty much most of what was going to be printed on paper needed to have this special stamped paper. And when you bought the stamped paper, you were effectively paying the tax, right? That was a signal that you bought it, you paid the tax, and then that money would go to the government, and the British government would raise some money. Here's a picture of what an actual stamp looked like. Okay, so you would have this specially stamped mark on your document, your passenger list, your marriage certificate, your playing cards, your newspaper, and that was an indicator that you had paid the tax. And this had already been used in England. It worked really well. And it had raised a lot of money in England, and people didn't fuss about it. So when Parliament passes the Stamp Act on the colonies, they were not expecting trouble. They did not expect that the colonists would have a problem with it. On top of that, it's only going to cost the colonists a little, right? It's not like a super expensive tax. And the richer colonies would pay more than the poorer colonies. So it was fair to the poorer colonies. On top of that, England believed that this act was fair and necessary for a number of reasons. First off, people in England paid way more tax than the average colonists, 26 times the amount of taxes that the average colonist paid. England had just fought the French and Indian War, and that cost a lot of money. And part of why they fought that war was to help protect the colonies. So it's really only fair that the colonists should help pay for part of the war, part of that cost. And the tax is going to be used to pay for troops that would stay and defend the colonists. So in Parliament's mind, and in England's mind, this is a no-brainer, right? It's only fair. And they didn't really expect the colonists to have that much of a problem with it. But as you can see from these, the colonists were not happy about it at all. The picture on the left is called Tarring and Feathering the Stamp Collector. So you can see how the tax collector might be treated. And the one on the right, hanging the stamp collector in effigy. So meaning it's a dummy, it's not the actual stamp collector. But these would be ways to intimidate the people whose job it was to try to collect the tax. So the colonists aren't very happy about it. In fact, they're incredibly upset about it. They end up putting together, based out of New England, a group called the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty was probably the most prominent anti-tax group who sort of led the opposition against things like the Stamp Act. The Sons of Liberty would organize marches, right? Anti-Stamp Act marches. They would choose sort of a meeting point around a tree that they would nickname the Liberty Tree. And they would have these rallies with speeches, and they would talk about how unfair the tax was. And they would certainly, as we saw in the last picture, issue threats to stamp sellers, sometimes actually physically harm the stamp sellers to intimidate them. They even went so far as to encourage mobs to destroy the homes of stamp sellers, and even in Massachusetts, the lieutenant governor, one of the highest officials in the colony, saw his home attacked by basically these mobs. Opponents also had some more peaceful ways to protest. They organized, for the first time, really, a group of representatives from across the colonies, what was called the Stamp Act Congress. And this was a group that came together to come up with a collective solution, right? None of us are happy about this Stamp Act, so how are we going to work together to do something about it? And through their conversations, they came up with some solutions. They decided they were going to boycott English products. That means to refuse to buy them. And they said, we'll send the king a petition. Right? A petition is basically a letter explaining to the king why they felt it was unfair. Right? Really, the colonists blamed Parliament for this tax. They didn't blame the king. So they thought, well, maybe we get the king on our side. Maybe the king can step in and help us out. Another important impact of the Stamp Act Congress is that the leaders who got together and met for the Stamp Act Congress started writing to each other. They started basically almost like a society of pen pals, kind of, right, where they would stay in contact so that they could coordinate their protests. And these were called committees of correspondence. Basically just a fancy way of saying, hey, let's stay in touch with each other. Let's start making connections and getting to know each other a little bit better. And that's important because those same leaders are going to be in touch down the road when it comes time for us to break away from England. At the end of the day, England finally decides to cancel the Stamp Act, primarily because the boycott was hurting English workers and English businesses. So people in England were fussing and saying, hey, this is hurting us. You're supposed to be making us money, and instead we're losing money. But Parliament wanted to make sure that the colonists knew who was boss. And they came out and said, look, we're going to take away the Stamp Act, but we can still tax the colonists if we want to. And to prove its authority, Parliament passed a new set of taxes. So they took away the Stamp Act, but they put in a new set of taxes on paper, paint, tea, lead, and glass. And again, this was not like a massive tax, but it was almost more of a ceremonial or representative type of tax, just to simply say we can. They also gave British officials unlimited rights to search colonial homes and businesses in order to stop smuggling. So British officials in the colonies were given the authority to crack down on smuggling. They could, bust into colonial businesses and try to find goods that were being illegally traded and seize those goods. So they were given a lot more power to try to crack down on smuggling. So 2 response questions here for this set of notes. The first one, the Stamp Act was really not a huge tax. It was really a relatively minor tax that the colonists were being asked to pay. So why were the colonists so upset about it? That's the first one. Why do you think they were so upset about it? It could be a couple of reasons. And the second question is, do you think the colonists were right to be upset? Or do you think the British were right to think that the tax was fair and necessary? So, could be either one, all right? I don't really care which side you take there. But do you think the colonists were right to be upset? If so, why? Or do you think the British were right to think that the tax was fair and necessary? If so, why? Type up your answers for your response questions. Check them over to make sure they make clear sense. And then save your work, print it out before the start of the next class.